Juliana West stepped onto the plane with the kind of elegance that made people glance twice. Dressed in a crisp navy blouse tucked into high-waisted slacks, her confident stride and composed expression gave her an air of quiet authority. In one hand, she carried a sleek leather tote bag, and in the other, a boarding pass marked 1A First Class. The cabin air smelled faintly of citrus and leather. As Juliana made her way to the front, she nodded politely at a few passengers. Her eyes briefly scanned seat numbers until she arrived at hers. The man beside her, an elderly businessman in a charcoal suit, gave her a courteous nod, which she returned with a soft smile. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, took her seat, and immediately pulled out a compact tablet and stylus. A spreadsheet glowed on the screen, but Juliana's attention seemed more focused on her notes than anything around her. Minutes passed quietly until a flight attendant entered the cabin. Her name tag read Heather Langley. With sharp cheekbones and a perfectly tucked bun, Heather looked every bit the picture of corporate professionalism. But her eyes held a cool sharpness that often preceded judgment. As Heather moved through the aisle, her gaze landed on Juliana and lingered. She paused beside seat 1A, her expression tightening. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said with forced politeness. "May I see your boarding pass?" Juliana looked up, surprised but not rattled. She handed it over without hesitation. "Of course." Heather read it, frowned, read it again. "This is first class," she said, her tone carrying a hint of doubt. "That's right," Juliana replied calmly. "I booked it last week." There was a pause. Heather's lips thinned. "Thank you," she said shortly, returning the pass. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply turned and walked away, but not before glancing once more over her shoulder at Juliana. Juliana raised an eyebrow, shrugged slightly, and resumed her work. But a few rows away, Heather was already speaking to another attendant in hushed tones. "I'm telling you, she doesn't belong up here," Heather whispered. "Something's off." "Her boarding pass is valid," the other attendant replied. Heather didn't respond right away. Her jaw clenched. A few minutes later, Heather returned, her voice now more firm. "Miss West, can I speak to you privately near the galley?" Passengers turned their heads as Juliana calmly rose from her seat, tablet in hand. As they reached the back of the first-class cabin, Heather crossed her arms. "There may have been a mistake with your booking," she said. "I'm going to need you to move to the main cabin." Juliana blinked. "I'm sorry, but that can't be correct. This was a confirmed reservation." "I don't believe this seat is appropriate for you," Heather replied, her tone dropping in warmth. Juliana took a breath. "You mean to say it's inappropriate for me to sit in first class?" Heather's voice stiffened. "Please don't make this difficult. I can call security if needed." The word security hung heavy in the air. Juliana nodded slowly. "No need. I'll move." With that, she returned to her seat, retrieved her bag, and followed Heather to the back. The first-class passengers watched with a mixture of confusion, discomfort, and silence. Juliana took the center seat in row 17 without a word. Her face remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly on her tablet. She wasn't angry, not yet. But she had already sent a message, and she had no intention of letting this pass. The hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin as Juliana sat in her new seat, legs crossed, tablet tucked away. The center seat was cramped, her elbows occasionally brushing the passengers beside her. Neither offered a word, just subtle glances. She didn't mind. Juliana reached into her tote and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved with silent confidence as she typed a message to a contact labeled DSHQ. Subject: Incident in progress. Relocated from seat 1A without cause. Contact me for further instruction. No escalation yet. Awaiting green light. She hit send, slipped the phone into her bag, and leaned back. Across the aisle, a younger flight attendant with warm eyes approached. Her name tag read Elena. "Excuse me, ma'am," Elena said gently, holding out a bottle of water. "Is everything all right?" Juliana smiled. "Just a misunderstanding." Elena hesitated. She clearly knew something had happened, but sensed Juliana wasn't ready to explain. "Well, if there's anything I can do—" "There might be," Juliana said, her eyes twinkling. "But not just yet. Thank you, Elena." Elena gave a respectful nod and walked off. Juliana turned back to the window. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Heather was glowing with smug energy. She handed out drinks, offered tight smiles, and avoided eye contact with any fellow crew members who might question her decision. Her colleague Max, an experienced attendant in his 50s with a calm voice, raised an eyebrow when Heather joined him in the galley. "You moved someone?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Heather stiffened. "I followed protocol. She didn't look like she belonged there." Max didn't respond at first. He simply glanced down at the manifest on the tablet in his hand. "Juliana West," he read aloud. "Do you know who she is?" "No," Heather replied. "Should I?" Max stared at her for a moment. "She's an executive advisor to one of our major corporate partners, one of those passengers who can get the CEO on the phone before we even land." Heather's face paled, just for a second. "How was I supposed to know?" "You weren't," Max said, "which is why you should have followed the manifest, not your gut." Back in row 17, Juliana's phone buzzed silently in her lap. She opened it to see a response. "Confirmed. HQ alerted. Monitoring flight systems. Expect contact soon. Hold position." Juliana smiled faintly. The game had begun. To the passengers around her, she looked serene. She flipped through the in-flight magazine and sipped her water. But inside, she was tracking everything. Movements of the attendants, glances cast her way, every whisper that passed near her row. And then, as if on cue, the intercom dinged. "Ms. Langley, please report to the galley." Heather frowned. She passed by row 17, throwing a quick glance at Juliana, who didn't look up. Inside the galley, Max was waiting with the in-flight phone in his hand. "It's for you," he said. "They asked for you by name." Heather took the receiver slowly. "This is Heather." The voice on the other end was cool, clipped, and unmistakably high-ranking. "This is Operations Control. We've received an alert regarding a possible service discrepancy involving a passenger named Juliana West. We are conducting an in-flight review. Please stand by for instructions and refrain from further seat changes or confrontations." Heather nearly dropped the phone. "I understood," she managed. As she placed the receiver back down, Max spoke again, his tone softer now. "You just stirred up something bigger than you realize." Heather didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward the main cabin, where Juliana sat as still as stone. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the storm. Heather emerged from the galley with stiff shoulders and a pale face. Her mind raced, her once assured steps now weighed down by uncertainty. The words from Operations Control echoed in her head like turbulence through a silent sky. In row 17, Juliana remained poised. She had closed her eyes briefly, appearing to rest. But in reality, she was listening to footsteps, whispers, and the occasional cough from the crew. Elena, the young flight attendant, passed by again. This time, she paused. "I just wanted to check again. Are you absolutely sure there's nothing I can get you, Miss West?" she asked more quietly. Juliana opened her eyes. She smiled with a warmth that felt deliberate, even calculated. "Actually," she said, "could you do me one small favor?" Elena leaned closer. "Of course." "Let the captain know," Juliana said gently, "that I appreciate his team's professionalism." Elena blinked in surprise. Yes, ma'am, right away." Up in the cockpit, Captain Miller was reviewing weather data when a quiet knock came at the door. Elena passed the message calmly. The captain raised an eyebrow and turned to his co-pilot. "She knows," he said, almost to himself. Back in first class, Heather tried to focus on her routine. She poured drinks with robotic precision, cleaned up trays, offered blankets to anyone who looked cold, but her mind refused to settle. She could feel the glances from other crew members, the subtle shift in tone when they spoke to her. Even Max kept a distance now. He had said what he needed to say. Heather's biggest fear wasn't that she had made a mistake. It was that she had made one in front of someone who had power, and now she was watching that power move in silence. Juliana checked her phone. A new message had arrived. "DS, Captain notified. Ops control updated. Keep calm. Ground team preparing reception." She tucked the phone away, her heart steady. A man across the aisle leaned toward her slightly. He was middle-aged, with glasses and a quiet, watchful demeanor. "Pardon me," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't help but notice earlier. Was everything all right?" Juliana turned to him. Her expression was calm, kind, but her eyes held steel. "There was a misunderstanding," she replied, "but it's being resolved." The man hesitated. "I don't mean to intrude. I've just seen things like this before." Juliana smiled faintly. "And now, you'll see what happens when it's handled properly." The man leaned back slowly, thoughtful. In the galley, Heather reached for the crew intercom again, but this time her hands were trembling. She didn't call anyone. She just stood there, staring at her reflection in the polished surface of the coffee dispenser. Who was Juliana West, really? Who had she just crossed? Heather didn't know the answer yet, but she could feel it coming like a storm front rolling in from the horizon. At that moment, Juliana reached into her tote once more and pulled out her notebook. Her pen glided across the page in clean, steady strokes. She wasn't journaling, she was documenting. Preparing, position, time, personnel, response, compliance. Every line she wrote made the air around her feel heavier. And yet, she looked completely at peace. Because for Juliana West, this wasn't the beginning of a conflict. It was the beginning of a reckoning. As the aircraft cruised above the clouds, a deceptive calmness blanketed the cabin. But inside Heather Langley's chest, a storm churned. She had stopped pretending everything was fine. Her eyes constantly flicked toward the main cabin, where Juliana West sat in row 17, calm, unreadable, and completely in control. Heather whispered to herself, "She's just a passenger, one passenger." But even she didn't believe that anymore. In the first-class galley, Max stood over the manifest tablet, tapping through security clearance logs and profiles. He found what he was looking for in less than a minute. Juliana West, Executive Liaison to the Diversity and Ethics Committee, Northeast Air Corporate Board. He inhaled through his teeth. "Heather, what did you do?" Down in the main cabin, Juliana was writing again. But now it was different. She wasn't documenting, she was planning. Her pen hovered over the words, Phase 2. Upon landing, meet team, debrief with board, review media protocol. A light chime echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently flying at 32,000 feet. Weather at our destination is clear. Thank you for choosing Northeast Air. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of your flight." Juliana smiled. It was the calm before the consequences. In the galley, Max approached Heather with a quiet intensity. "You need to fix this," he said bluntly. "I tried," Heather snapped, her confidence crumbling. "I apologized. I offered her water. She refused." Max shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. She's not just connected. She writes the ethics code we get trained on." Heather's mouth fell open slightly. "That can't be true." Max raised the tablet. "Look." Heather read the line under Juliana's name. "Oversight Contributor, Internal Equity Protocols, In-Flight Operations." Heather's knees nearly gave out. In row 17, Juliana's phone buzzed again. "Final briefing ready. Legal has statements prepared. Clara is on standby if needed." Juliana turned slightly in her seat and caught sight of Alina, the young flight attendant who had shown her kindness earlier. Alina smiled at her from across the aisle, then looked away quickly. Juliana made a note. "Alina, observe professionalism. Recommend commendation." At the front of the plane, Heather found herself pacing. Max stepped in front of her. "You're spiraling," he said. "You need to stop making this worse." "I didn't know who she was," Heather hissed under her breath. "And that's the problem," Max said. "You thought you had to know who someone is before treating them with respect." Heather didn't answer. She was too busy remembering how Juliana had looked at her in the galley. Not angry, not vengeful, just disappointed. 30 minutes later, the in-flight phone rang again. Max picked it up, listened, then turned to Heather. "It's Ops Control again. They're escalating. You're to prepare a written incident log the moment we land." Heather's jaw clenched. "What does that mean?" Max replied softly. "It means the board wants a record, and that usually means someone's about to be reviewed or removed." As the captain announced the initial descent, Juliana placed her notebook back into her bag and straightened her jacket. Around her, passengers began to stir, some stretching, others reaching for bags. But Juliana was still, waiting. Heather watched her from the galley, but this time she didn't feel contempt or superiority. She felt dread, and something else too, regret. Because whether or not Heather Langley knew it, the moment she judged Juliana West by how she looked instead of who she was, she'd sealed her fate. The cabin tilted slightly as the plane began its gradual descent. Seatbelts clicked, window shades rose. Flight attendants moved with well-practiced efficiency, checking trays and gently waking sleeping passengers. But the air felt different, tense, controlled, and at the center of it, Juliana West, silent, still, perfectly composed, was preparing for impact. Not from the plane, from the reckoning. At the front of the cabin, Captain Miller stood behind the cockpit door, speaking quietly to the lead ground coordinator via headset. Confirmed, she'll be met by legal, HR, and 2 board representatives. Yes, she's already been briefed. No, she hasn't asked for special treatment. She doesn't need to. He ended the call and turned to his co-pilot. Let's make sure our crew doesn't screw this up further. In the galley, Heather Langley held a clipboard she could barely read through her anxiety. Her hands trembled as she attempted to complete the preliminary incident report, but the words blurred. Max stood beside her, arms folded. "You should talk to her," he said quietly. Heather looked at him, stunned. "Talk to her? About what?" "About what happened. About what you did. About how you made her feel." Heather's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, she realized she had nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. In row 17, Juliana glanced at her phone one last time. Legal team in position at gate 14, security on standby, internal affairs rep waiting for statement. She typed a calm reply. "Understood. Please ensure media stays clear until further notice. Prioritize discretion." As she locked her screen, Elena appeared again. "Miss West," she said gently, "we're landing soon. If you need anything at all, please let me know." Juliana nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Elena. I mean it. You've handled yourself beautifully." Elena's cheeks flushed pink. "It's really an honor to serve you." Juliana reached out and gently touched her hand. "People like you? You're the future of this airline." The wheels touched down with a soft bump. The cabin jolted lightly and a murmur of relief rolled through the passengers. Seatbelt signs dinged off. Passengers stood, retrieving bags and shuffling into the aisle. But Juliana didn't move. Not yet. At the exit, Heather stood like a statue, clipboard now held behind her back. Her smile was gone, her practiced hospitality replaced by uncertainty. Every second felt like a countdown. Passengers began to disembark. Juliana remained seated until the aisle was nearly clear. Then, gracefully, she stood. Max stepped forward to greet her with a respectful nod. "Miss West, it's been an honor." Juliana gave him a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you, Max. I've noted your professionalism." Heather swallowed hard as Juliana approached. "Miss West," she began, barely above a whisper, I want to say I'm sorry. I misjudged you. I misjudged the situation." Juliana tilted her head slightly, studying her, not with malice, but with something far more piercing, truth. "I'm not here for apologies," Juliana replied calmly. "I'm here for accountability." Heather blinked, but Juliana continued walking past her, out the cabin door, where a team of legal and corporate personnel waited just beyond the jet bridge. Behind her, Heather remained frozen, watching the woman she had tried to shrink now stand taller than anyone else on the tarmac. And in that moment, Heather realized this wasn't about who Juliana West was. It was about what she had become, a mirror held up to a system. And the reflection wasn't pretty. The moment Juliana stepped into the terminal, the temperature of the space seemed to shift. She was met by a composed woman in a navy suit, a man with an ID badge from the airline's internal compliance unit, and a third figure, her legal counsel, Danielle Brooks. "Miss West," Danielle greeted her with a professional nod. "Everything is prepared. The board members are already reviewing the preliminary footage and your documentation." Juliana returned the nod. "Good. Let's move quickly. I don't want this turning into a spectacle." The group moved with quiet precision past the regular passengers. Most didn't recognize Juliana, but a few from the flight slowed down to watch her pass, especially those who'd seen the confrontation in first class. They weren't seeing a victim. They were seeing a force. Inside a conference room just off gate 14, Juliana placed her bag down and removed her notebook. Danielle opened her laptop and began syncing notes. "We've received the in-flight incident report," Danielle said, "filed under urgency by a Max Emerson." Juliana looked up with a small smile. "That's the one flight attendant who knew how to read a manifest." Danielle continued. "Heather Langley's name is already flagged internally. Apparently, this isn't her first behavioral concern." Juliana raised an eyebrow. "Discrimination?" "No. Up until now, it's been minor infractions, but now the full scope's coming to light." Meanwhile, back inside the airport, Heather sat slouched in a private break room, her uniform wrinkled and her mind unraveling. Max stood beside her, silently sipping from a cup of water. I thought she was just another difficult passenger, Heather said, more to herself than to him. Max didn't reply immediately. No, he said finally. You didn't think she was difficult. You just didn't expect her to be in first class. Heather swallowed. You think I'm racist? Max gave a quiet shrug. I think you assumed something about her that had nothing to do with her ticket or her conduct. He turned and walked out. Inside the board's conference room, footage played. Audio of Heather's terse tone, her refusal to double-check Juliana's ticket, her demand that Juliana move without cause. There were no raised voices, no dramatic shouting, but the microaggressions were clear. And that was enough. Danielle handed Juliana a folder. The board is preparing to suspend her, pending a full inquiry. Juliana nodded. And the crew? Max will be recognized for protocol adherence. Elena will be formally commended. Juliana smiled faintly. Good. Let's make sure that happens publicly. Later that day, Heather was summoned to the administrative level. She was told to sit in a cold, windowless interview room. 2 HR representatives joined her. One read from a report while the other recorded the session. Miss Langley, the passenger you removed was Juliana West, executive liaison to our corporate ethics board. Your actions are now under internal investigation for violation of non-discrimination policy. Heather's throat tightened. I didn't know who she was. The HR rep cut her off. That's precisely the point. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. Heather sat back slowly, her heart beginning to break under the pressure of truth. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about how she saw people and what that said about her place in the system. Outside the hearing room, Juliana stood with Danielle and one of the airline's senior VPs. We appreciate your discretion, Miss West, the VP said. Would you consider consulting with us on policy revisions moving forward? Juliana gave him a measured smile. I don't want symbolism. I want structural change. If you're ready for that conversation, so am I. As Juliana exited the terminal and stepped into a waiting car, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The wheels of change were already in motion, and the message was clear. Prejudice had a price, and the invoice had just been delivered. Juliana sat at the head of a long glass table in a high-rise boardroom overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered in the afternoon sun, but her focus was squarely on the documents in front of her. Around her were key players from the airline, corporate legal, HR directors, policy architects, and the chief operating officer, Edward Chase. Juliana's tone was composed, but her eyes were sharp. This isn't just about what happened to me, she said. This is about the hundreds of customers who don't have access to this table, who won't be listened to, who get moved without cause, questioned without reason, or ignored because they don't look the part. No one spoke for a moment. Then Edward Chase leaned forward. What would you suggest we do? Juliana didn't hesitate. She reached into her leather folio and placed 3 items on the table. A revised training framework for all in-flight staff focused on bias awareness. A restructuring of the reporting and accountability system, anonymous, immediate, and reviewed by a third party. A mentorship pipeline for young, diverse professionals within the airline workforce. She tapped the last document. And this is what builds loyalty, trust, and long-term culture shift. Back at the airline's employee headquarters, Heather waited in an HR holding room. She had been suspended pending investigation, and rumors of her removal were already circulating among the crew. In her hands was a printed letter, Juliana West's official complaint summary. It was professional, respectful, and devastatingly clear. There were no exaggerations, no embellishments, just facts, undeniable. Meanwhile, Elena, the young attendant who had shown Juliana kindness, was being briefed by HR, not for discipline, but for recognition. Your attentiveness and tone during the incident helped de-escalate what could have been much worse, the HR officer told her. Miss West has personally recommended you for the new crew ambassador program. Elena blinked. I didn't think she even noticed me. She noticed everything. The next morning, headlines began to circulate in trade newsletters and corporate roundups. Airline launches major cultural reforms following internal ethics breach. In response to an incident involving an executive board advisor, Northeast Air is launching sweeping policy changes to address bias in customer service and internal culture. Juliana didn't read the articles. She didn't need to. What mattered more were the quiet internal shifts, teams starting to talk about what bias really looks like, crew members rethinking their habits, mid-level managers asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. The seed had been planted. 2 days later, Juliana received a direct message from Captain Miller. "Miss West, thank you for how you handled everything. The crew has been talking. What you did, it mattered." She replied simply, "Thank you, Captain. Tell your team we're just getting started." Across the city, Heather sat alone in her apartment. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from HR. Her employment had been officially terminated. Attached was a summary of the review findings. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat very still, staring out the window at nothing. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't Juliana's fault. It was her own. And if she ever wanted to rebuild, the first thing she had to do was face that truth. Juliana, meanwhile, stood in front of a group of junior airline recruits at a leadership conference. No cameras, no speeches, just a story. Respect, she told them, isn't something you reserve for people who look powerful. It's something you extend to everyone, because you never know who's watching, who's listening, or who might be the one holding the mirror up when you least expect it. They listened, really listened. And that was enough for now. It had been 3 weeks since the flight. For most passengers, the memory of Flight 287 had faded into the blur of everyday travel. But inside the offices of Northeast Air and beyond, ripples continued to widen. Juliana West had declined interviews, refused media appearances, and quietly turned down an op-ed request from a major newspaper. "This isn't about publicity," she told Danielle. "It's about precedent." And quietly, that precedent was taking root. At Northeast Air's Regional Training Center, a new module titled Unseen Bias, Real Scenarios from Real Flights was being piloted with instructors and senior staff. The first case study? Flight 287. Names were omitted, but everyone knew. At the end of the training, one young flight attendant trainee stood up and said, "I think I would have reacted the same way Heather did." There was a heavy pause. Then she added, "But now I won't." Meanwhile, in a modest office building across the city, Heather Langley sat at a desk, dressed in plain clothes. Her name tag was simple: Volunteer, Equity Insight Foundation. It was a nonprofit that offered corporate diversity workshops, and Heather had applied, quietly, anonymously, asking for a chance to learn, not teach. To her surprise, the director had accepted. "This isn't redemption," the director told her. "It's responsibility." Heather nodded. "I don't want to fix my reputation. I want to fix me." And so, every day, she read, she listened, she sat in uncomfortable conversations and didn't interrupt. She took notes, and for the first time, she didn't feel like shrinking away from herself. Juliana, on the other hand, was back in motion, traveling between cities, advising companies, and continuing her work with ethical policy design. But something had shifted in her too. After a keynote event in Atlanta, she paused outside a terminal gate, watching a flight crew greet boarding passengers. There was a warmth there, a presence. She didn't expect perfection. She just wanted awareness. Elena, the kind flight attendant from that infamous flight, had recently messaged her. "They offered me a leadership track. I said yes, thank you for seeing me when others didn't." Juliana smiled as she read the words, because that's what this had always been about: being seen, being heard, being human. Later that evening, Juliana visited her parents for dinner. Over homemade pasta and wine, her father asked, "Are you tired of fighting yet?" Juliana laughed lightly. "Always. But I don't fight with anger. I fight with focus." Her mother touched her hand, and with grace. Juliana thought about Heather, about second chances, about systems that break people before they teach them. "Sometimes grace," she said softly, "is the sharpest tool we have." It started with an email, short, respectful, hesitant, from h.langley@equityinsight.org to juliana.west@corethics.net. Subject: Request, Miss West, I understand you have every reason to ignore this message, but if there's ever a moment when you'd be willing to speak with me, not as adversaries, but as women who've both been changed by the same event, I would be grateful. I have no excuses, just the hope of understanding. Heather Langley. Juliana stared at the screen for several minutes. She didn't delete it. She didn't reply. Not yet. A week later, inside a small neutral cafe tucked into a quiet side street, Juliana arrived early. She ordered chamomile tea, sat by the window, and waited. At exactly 11 a.m., Heather walked in. She looked different, less stiff, more worn, more real. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her clothes were simple, and her eyes carried something Juliana hadn't seen on the flight: humility. Heather approached slowly. "Thank you for agreeing to this," she said, her voice barely audible. Juliana gestured toward the seat across from her. "Have a seat." Heather sat. Silence lingered between them for a moment, stretching thin. Then Juliana broke it. "Why did you want this meeting?" Heather inhaled deeply. "Because I needed to look you in the eye and say what an email can't." Juliana's gaze didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "Go ahead." Heather leaned forward slightly, her hands folded. "I judged you, quickly, unfairly, and for reasons I didn't even fully understand at the time. You didn't do anything wrong. You were calm, respectful, dignified, and I treated you like a threat." Juliana listened, her expression unreadable. Heather continued. "I lost my job, but I didn't lose because of you. I lost because of me, because I refused to reflect until I was forced to." She swallowed. "I want you to know that I've been learning, not to clear my name, just to never repeat what I did to you, or to anyone else." Juliana finally spoke. "Do you know what I felt the moment you told me I didn't belong?" Heather shook her head. Juliana's voice remained even. "Not anger, not even shock, just exhaustion. Because I've lived in that moment so many times with hotel clerks, store security, executives in meetings who ask me to bring coffee." Heather looked down, ashamed. "I didn't need your apology," Juliana continued. "I needed your awareness, your ability to see past assumption." Heather looked up. "And now," Juliana tilted her head, "now I see someone trying to rebuild from truth, and that means something." Heather blinked back sudden tears. "I'm not asking for forgiveness." "I know," Juliana said. Then after a pause, "But you have my respect for showing up, for staying in the discomfort." The silence returned, but this time it was gentle. Juliana finished her tea. "This doesn't make us friends," Heather nodded quickly. "Of course. But it makes us part of the same story," Juliana said. "And that story's not over yet." As they stood to leave, Heather reached out instinctively, then stopped herself. Juliana extended her hand. They shook. No smiles, no performance, just quiet resolve. Outside the cafe, Juliana walked away into the afternoon light. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt human. And that was enough. 3 months after Flight 287, the airline unveiled its new Passenger Dignity and Equity Initiative in a live internal broadcast to all employees. Juliana West was invited as a guest speaker. She stood on a modest stage inside the airline's leadership hall, dressed in a navy blue blazer, her tone calm, her presence commanding. Behind her, a screen displayed 3 words: "Dignity is standard." She began, "You may not remember my name, but you might remember the story. I was the passenger who got bumped, but I'm not here because of what was done to me. I'm here because of what we did after." The room was silent. Across the country, thousands of crew members, agents, and managers watched from break rooms, offices, and terminals. Juliana continued, "Accountability isn't a punishment. It's a chance to do better. And better begins with seeing every person who walks onto your plane as someone worthy of your highest professionalism. Not because of their title, not because of what they're wearing, but because they are human. That's the seat they're always entitled to." She ended with quiet dignity, no dramatic flourish, and it was more powerful than anything she could have shouted. Backstage, Elena, now a uniformed senior crew leader, greeted her with a smile. "They're still talking about you in crew chat groups, but this time, it's all gratitude." Juliana smiled softly. "Good, that's the altitude we should all be aiming for." Across the city, Heather Langley stood at the back of a community center, watching a group of new volunteers run a bias training workshop. She had written part of the curriculum. She didn't need to lead anymore. She just wanted to support. As she packed up handouts, one of the newer volunteers approached her. "You used to be a flight attendant, right?" Heather nodded. "What made you switch paths?" Heather hesitated for a breath, then said, "I was part of the problem. Now I want to be part of the solution." The volunteer nodded, not prying further. Heather smiled. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it felt honest. Back in the city, Juliana stepped onto another flight. No fanfare, no incident. Just a quiet seat by the window, 2A. The attendant approached her with a warm, neutral smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss West. May I offer you something to drink? Juliana glanced up. She didn't recognize this crew member, and that was the point. She wasn't being treated well because of who she was. She was being treated well because that was now the standard. As the plane rose gently into the sky, Juliana opened her notebook. She wrote a single line. The work never ends, but neither does the sky. She looked out the window. Clouds drifted beneath her, soft and endless. And with quiet satisfaction, Juliana West flew forward, toward a future she helped reimagine.